All right, welcome everybody. Thanks to you, everybody, for coming out tonight. Good to see you all here. Just a little bit, try to keep the opening announcements brief so we can get to the debate as quickly as possible. But just a little bit about our organization. My name is Vic Wang, and I am the president of Humanists of Houston. And we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting principles of secular humanism throughout Houston. And so we do all kinds of events. We do guest speakers, debates, such as this. We have discussion groups. We do volunteer outings at various charities. And we do activism. And we also just do social events as well. So if you're not on Meetup, please join the HOH Meetup group, which is actually, we're actually the largest Meetup group, or the largest chapter of the American Humanist Association in the country, and the largest humanist meetup group in the world. And actually, in fact, we just surpassed today, we're actually now the largest out of any humanist, atheist, or skeptic meetup group in the world. We're actually now #1. We just took that over today. So,
how many members?
3106 last I looked. So yeah, please join us out there on Meetup, and then you can see our full calendar of events, RSVP for events, and get reminders and whatnot for all the different activities we have going on, which is typically we average about 20 plus events per month. So, yeah, as far as today, so very proud to host this debate, which has been kind of a long time in the making. It's kind of fortuitous that they were able to meet here in Houston to hold this debate, since neither of them lives here in Houston. Aron is in Dallas, while Mr. Ahmad is in the UK. So just so happened we could get both of them here today to hold this event, which is going to be a debate on evolution. Specifically, is Darwinian evolution a fact? Mr. Ahmad will actually be taking the position, the affirmative position, that it is not a fact, and this will be going first. Just a reminder also that we have questions, we have postcards, index cards, I should say, in each chair, as well as pens. If you don't have one, just raise your hand and someone can bring you one. Those will be for the questions. We're going to do all the questions in written form today, so feel free to submit your question at any time. Just raise your hand, and then somebody will come and pick it up. Either Robert over here or Kathy over here will come pick it up, and then we will select the questions. Hopefully we'll have time for all of them, but if not, our moderator, who we'll be introducing shortly, will make the selections on which questions to select. We do ask everybody, of course, to remain quiet and civil throughout the debate. Please be respectful of both of the debaters and moderator, and please no outbursts. And also, again, there's snacks in the back. Feel free to help yourselves. Got some cookies and candy back there, and restrooms and water fountain are out in the hallway back there. So. Yeah, one thing we wanted to really try to do is make this debate as neutral as possible and as fair as possible. So hence we're holding it at a neutral venue, and we went out of our way to try to find, thanks to Interfaith Ministries of Greater Houston, we were able to find our moderator for this event, who is a Christian. So we did want to make sure we did not have our moderator was neither an atheist nor a Muslim, to try to keep things fair. So I'll go ahead and introduce our moderator for this evening, who is Sarah Stone. And Sarah is the director of Singles and Young Adults at Memorial Drive Presbyterian Church, and a single mother of 2. She completed a master's in counseling psychology at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Chicago, and practiced family and couples therapy before moving to Texas. As an energetic extrovert with a passion for singles and young adults, she gets excited about building community, event planning, counseling, and discipleship. In her free time, you'll find Sarah exploring Houston's newest foodie spots, playing the guitar, or dancing the night away. So please welcome our moderator to the stage. Sarah Stout.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Ooh, this is tall. Let's make it a little shorter. Thank you so much for having me. This is my first time doing anything with the Humanists of Houston. I'm excited. When he asked me for my bio, I sent him what's on our church website, and it has all this stuff at the end about what I do in my free time. And then I read their bios, and they were very scholarly and serious. So I think when you guys get up, you should tell us what you do when you're not debating. You know, like, do you enjoy long walks on the beach? Or, you know, make it your own. But yes, we're going to be having 20 minutes dedicated to each of our speakers. Both will get up and begin. And then we're going to give them each 10 minutes for rebuttal. And then we're going to spend another 20 minutes letting them just kind of have a one-on-one discussion. And I think my job in the middle is just to make sure it doesn't come to fists or get crazy. After that, we'll take a short break. And all that time, hopefully, you're writing questions. We'll take a look at those questions and come back to do a Q&A time, which I'm really excited about. I'm excited about the whole thing. I'm looking forward to learning. But let me introduce our first guest, Subboor Ahmad. He's the former head of Mission of Dawah and an instructor and lecturer for the Islamic Education and Research Academy, which is an Islamic missionary group. He is a student of Islamic thought and studies the philosophy of biology, has previously studied engineering at City University of London. Subboor has produced several videos promoting Islam on the YouTube channel of the London Dawah movement, which he is the head of, as well as videos critical of evolution at the Darwinian Delusions YouTube channel. So please welcome Mr. Ahmad.
Can I move this?
You can adjust it, yeah. Yeah.
Is that okay? Can I talk from here? Okay.
Sounds good.
Welcome. So, I'm going to begin as Muslims do, in the name of God, the Lord of mercy, the giver of mercy. Now, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, I think something we can all pretty much agree with, if we believe in God, that is, that if you're not grateful to people, you're not grateful to God. So the first thing I'd like to do is to thank Aron and the Humanist Society for facilitating this discussion, and as a gift, as a gesture of my gratefulness, I've bought a family of fossilized baby trilobites from Wales as a gift for you guys. And because there's one thing we can all agree about as Christians, Muslims, Jews, humanists and non-humans amongst us, if there's any, it's that nature is full of wonders. I'm sure we can all agree with that. So, question tonight, is Darwinian evolution a fact? Now, it's very important before you get into a discussion, you define what you mean. So what I mean by fact is something which is certain, something which is absolute, something that does not change. Now, I don't have any issue, and no one should have an issue, calling Darwinian evolution a working model, a working paradigm, and a working theory, but not a fact. Now, it's also important to define what a theory is, and this is what Aron says, and I'm just going to plug his book here, Foundational Falsehoods of Creationism. He says, theory is the highest level of confidence science can get. A theory is a field of study and a body of knowledge enveloping a collection of facts, hypotheses, and natural laws. Now, I generally think that's okay to use as a definition. And the reason why I believe Darwinian evolution is not a fact is because scientific theories are not absolute. Darwinian evolution is a scientific theory, therefore Darwinian evolution is not absolute. And the only people I'm going to be referring to today are mainstream secular academics, mainstream philosophers of science, and mainstream evolutionary biologists. I'm also going to be making the case that Darwinian evolution is not a fact, but also that it is speculative, based on assumptions, and there's disputes about its most fundamental ideas. And I think one of the reasons why some people they think Darwinian evolution is a fact is because of their misunderstanding of what science can achieve. And I believe Aron has that misunderstanding. He says in one of his videos, understand that all of science is revisable doesn't mean conclusions can change, just that they can be revised. And this is the polar opposite of what evolutionary biologist Henry Gee, who's also the senior editor of the most prestigious journal in the world, Nature, has to say about science. He says conclusions can change, conclusions can be wrong, And science can only ever give you provisional conclusions. So how do we decide between two polar views here? Well, what we have to do is we have to look at the philosophy of science. Now, the philosophy of science teaches us that based upon a limited set of observations, scientists make a general conclusion, a general inference, a general theory. Now, there's two particular issues here. Firstly, you can always get novel observations, meaning observations which challenge your previous theories. Secondly, the same observations can be used to come up with multiple theories. So because of these two reasons in the philosophy of science, conclusions can change and theories are not absolute. So Aron, I believe, is out of line when it comes to mainstream philosophers of science. And this is what it says in Philosophy of Science, a new introduction by Oxford University. Talk of scientific proof is dangerous because the term fosters the idea of conclusions that are graven in stone. So Henry Gee is correct, and he is in line with philosophers of science when he says conclusions can be wrong, conclusions can change, conclusions are always provisional. Now, somebody can come along and say, wait, Darwinian evolution has been so successful, it's given us so many predictions which have been confirmed, it's got to be true. Well, just here at the University of Texas, we have the philosopher of science, Larry Loden, and he's put together a philosophical paper where he puts together 30 scientific theories which were empirically quite successful, but which turned out to be false. And this is a well-known, understood thing in the philosophy of science. No matter how successful a theory is, it doesn't mean it won't change. It doesn't mean it is a fact in the absolute sense. Now, this is what it says in the Philosophy of Science, a very short introduction again by Oxford University. Historically, there are many cases of theories that we now believe to be false that were empirically quite successful. So clearly, no matter how successful a theory is, it doesn't mean you can call it an absolute. Also, somebody can say there is no alternative when it comes to the history of evolution other than the Darwinian paradigm. Well, let's just take that at face value. Let's just say there is no alternative when it comes to the Darwinian picture of life. It still doesn't mean that it is absolute. This is what the philosopher of science Carl Stanford explains. There are alternatives to our best theories, equally well confirmed by the evidence, even when we are unable to conceive of them at the time. And somebody else can also make a claim. There is a complete consensus amongst all evolutionary biologists that Darwinian evolution is largely correct. Now again, I'm going to take this at face value. Let's just assume every single evolutionary biologist from the time of Darwin till today believes Darwinian evolution is correct. It still doesn't mean it is an absolute, because we can have paradigm shifts in science. So a complete consensus is still based on a conclusion which is provisional. This is what it says in Evidence in Evolution, published by Cambridge University. The best that scientists can do at any time, this is the absolute best they can do, is to render comparative judgments between theories. But there is something Aron is correct upon. He says, 100 years ago we had the theories of evolution, gravity, atomic theory, cell theory, and the germ theory of the disease. All these fields have improved since then, but we're still focused on the fact of evolution, gravity, cells, and germs. So I totally agree that there always will be a theory of evolution. And I'm going to be explaining what I mean by evolution, because I think we need to define those terms as well. So just to summarize, observations are facts. Theories are not facts, although they're based on observations, as per Aron's previous definition in his book, which I agree with. Because of two particular issues: multiple theories based upon the same observations, and secondly, novel observations that can challenge your previous conclusions. So philosophy of science teaches theories are not absolute. Darwinian evolution is a scientific theory, therefore Darwinian evolution is not absolute. And it's also very important at this moment to define the difference between Darwinian evolution and evolution. Evolution simply is an observation of biological change. From that perspective, it is an absolute fact. But it doesn't mean the tree of life, or natural selection being the cause behind the tree of life, is an absolute fact. Darwinian evolution is different to evolution. in Zoonomia, which was written by Erasmus Darwin, Darwin's grandfather, he uses evolution in that particular sense. In fact, in one sentence of that book, he uses evolution in a sense which is non-Darwinian, rapid saltational evolution. Secondly, in zoological philosophy by John Baptiste Lamarck, who came up with his Lamarckian evolution decades before Darwin, he also uses evolution in that general sense of biological change. So from that perspective, it is an observation. Now, Lamarckian evolution existed some decades before Darwin, and there's two particular parts to Lamarckian evolution. Number one, there was a history of evolution, which was represented by the bush of life. A multiple number of origins, parallel lines of evolution, organisms going from simple to more complex. It was like written within them to get more and more complex. Secondly, the mechanism by which that happened was the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Darwinism, likewise, Darwinian evolution, Darwin came along about 50 years after Lamarck, and he put together his own theory of evolution, which also had two parts. One was a history of evolution represented by the tree of life, and secondly was natural selection working on variations. Later on they called it mutations, but the same thing. This is what the philosopher of science Jerry Fodor explains. Darwin's theory of evolution has two parts. One is its familiar historical account of our phylogeny, the universal common ancestry tree of life. The other is the theory of natural selection. So I hope that is clear. Evolution, Darwinian evolution, and Lamarckian evolution. Because if you actually conflate them, it can create multiple levels of confusion. Now, in one of his comments, Aron said, "Why are we even bothering with the superfluous labels of Darwinian, natural and sexual selection, versus neo-Darwinian, selection plus genetics? Just call it evolution, that's what it is." I'm going to make the case that we shouldn't call Darwinian evolution or neo-Darwinian evolution, just call it evolution, because it creates confusion. For example, we know that bacteria mutates. This is a clear-cut evolution observation. We have observed this in the lab. Now, because that is true, does that mean the tree of life is true? Does that mean natural selection working on variations is the cause behind all that? And if we were to equate evolution with Lamarckian evolution, does that mean the bush of life is true? Does that mean the inheritance of acquired characteristics is true? Of course not. So we need to use our terms carefully. So when you're referring to the history of life, just call it the tree of life or universal common ancestry. When you're referring to the mechanism of evolution, just call it natural selection. Evolution simply means biological change over time, and it is an observation, and it is absolutely true. Okay, I'm also going to be making the case that Darwinian evolution is speculative, based on assumptions, and there's disputes about its most fundamental ideas. Now, why is Darwinian evolution speculative? For two reasons. Number one is reconstructing the evolutionary history of life on Earth is very difficult. Number one, we're speaking about something that has taken place over an incredibly long period of time, something like 4 billion years. Now, it's very difficult to try and reconstruct something that happened that long ago. And in the Journal of Theoretical Biology, there's a paper called Testing the Hypothesis of Common Ancestry. There's actually a section dedicated to why it's difficult to work out what happened in the past, and that's actually what they conclude. Secondly, we're talking about an incredibly large data set. According to the National Science Foundation, 99.999% of species are unobserved. Not organisms, species are unobserved. So whatever you try and make up, it is bound to be speculative. And this was a study that was just published in May this year. So whether you try and come up with the universal common ancestry tree of life, or you try and come up with like a Lamarckian multiple origins bush of life, or you try and come up with what some evolutionary biologists are referring to as the web of life or the net of life, or you believe in gradual evolution, which is, neo-Darwinism, or you believe in rapid saltational processes, or you believe in progression or non-progression, either way, it's an open season on the historical record of life on Earth, simply because so much of the data is missing, and also because we're speaking about something that happened a long time ago. Now, in science, it gives the analogy of working out the history of evolution in the following way. It is like trying to work out, and I want to use an example here. Actually, it's not big enough. Okay, It's like trying to work out the plot of Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, and this is not it, by the way, with 13 randomly selected pages. Right? Now imagine if you had that book, how many different plots, theories, ideas could you put together if you only had 13 randomly selected pages and all the rest of the pages were missing? Multiple. So why is it that we're sometimes told by people who should know better that the Darwinian picture is the only inference possible? And in his book, Foundational Falsehoods of Creation, I am really promoting your book here. It is a fact, this is what Aron says, it is a fact that everything on Earth has definitive relatives either living nearby or evident in the fossil record. And in a video he goes further. It would be perverse to say taxonomical classification are a fantastically improbable accident of coincidence. That would be a statistical impossibility which reaches into the realm of reality denial. It is an absolute fact. Now, he's clearly out of line with mainstream evolutionary biology. Just to give you an example, I've got it here, it's going to take me too long to rumble through the papers. There's a paper called A Formal Test of the Theory of Universal Common Ancestry, published in Nature. And this is what it says in the abstract. And I want you to put the words absolute fact and reality denial here, which is what Aron said, and put the words that they are saying on the other side. Although universal common ancestry is widely assumed, put that word there, it has rarely been subjected to formal quantitative testing. And this has led to critical commentary emphasizing the intrinsic technical difficulties in empirically evaluating a theory of such a broad scope. And clearly, no words like absolute fact, no words like reality denial. Secondly, Darwinian evolution is based upon assumptions, and some of these assumptions are being challenged by evolutionary biologists. For example, genes are transmitted vertically. We've discovered the process of horizontal gene transfer recently. The idea of gradualism. Some evolutionary biologists believe in rapid saltational processes. The tree of life. Some biologists are speaking about the web of life. You'll find this all over the place now. Inheritance of acquired characteristics are impossible. Just read the selfish gene, 1980s edition. It clearly mentions it is impossible to inherit acquired characteristics. This is classical neo-Darwinism. And now we've actually observed this, and this is published in mainstream journals. Mutations are random. Other biologists disagree. They believe mutations are directed. I'm going to explain what that means in a minute. According to the Oxford University biologist Dennis Noble, all the central assumptions of neo-Darwinism have been disproven. Now, by the way, just a small caveat, I don't agree with anything that these guys are saying. I'm not taking a position. I'm not saying what Dennis Noble said is right, and I'm not saying the evolutionary biologists that have the different views are right, that I subscribe to those views. I'm just showing you a difference of opinion. Lastly, there are disputes. Now, if Darwinian evolution was absolutely true, these books would not exist. Now I'm just going to explain each one of them, right? So evolution by natural genetic engineering is a total alternative to the Darwinian mechanism. It proposes external factors activate genome change operators. In English, that basically means mutations are not random, they are directed. And in Evolution, A View from the 21st Century, it mentions a whole new alternative to neo-Darwinism. And just one of the people who actually support, just to give you an idea of the sort of scientists who are behind this, is Carl Woese, the guy who discovered the third domain of life, right? Evolutionary biologists that are that important are looking into alternatives. Secondly, neo-Lamarckian evolution. Now, proponents argue inheritance of acquired characteristics drive rapid evolutionary change. In English, that basically means, that giraffe with his long neck, developed characteristics can be inherited and changes are fast, right? And they again challenge the idea of gradualism. Now, this is a book written by Eva Jablanka, evolutionary biologist, Transformations of Lamarckism, and it's a complete alternative on the neo-Darwinian mechanism. This is published by MIT University. So clearly, if Aron's correct, then reality denial and absolute fact, these guys don't seem to be agreeing with him there. Now, the last one, and I think this is quite an interesting one, this is actually referred to as the forgotten synthesis, Mendelian mutationism, right? So this challenges the idea of gradualism. It argues evolution takes place in rapid steps by large mutations, right? Now, this is a book published by Masatoshi Nai. I always get his name wrong, so I have to read it from here. Mutation-Driven Evolution, published by Oxford University, and he gives a complete alternative to the Darwinian mechanism. Now, they're not challenging the Darwinian history of life. They're challenging the Darwinian mechanism, although some are challenging it by proposing the web of life. Okay. Now, if Darwinian evolution was an absolute fact, then these books would not exist. The journals that they refer to that they've published in, the peer-reviewed journals, would not exist. And the universities that publish them, like MIT and Oxford, would not exist, but they clearly do. So, if it was an absolute fact, scientists wouldn't be proposing alternatives. And I just want to highlight a project before I end. It's called the Third Way of Evolution. And this project has scientists from China, and these are all evolutionary, secular, mainstream biologists, right? It has scientists from China, Europe, America, Oxford, Cambridge, MIT, Princeton, Harvard, and all of these secular biologists, they do not believe in the Darwinian mechanism, and they are proposing alternatives, and they believe it's fallen apart. Now again, I do not endorse any of their views. All I am doing is I'm sharing their project to show that there is difference of opinion. And the reason why it's called the third way is because they don't believe in intelligent design, they don't believe in creation science, and they don't believe in neo-Darwinism. So they're trying to find a third way. So just to summarize, scientific theories are not absolute. Darwinian evolution is a scientific theory. Therefore, Darwinian evolution is not absolute. And I defined fact in the beginning because there's multiple meanings of fact. Absolute doesn't have multiple meanings. Absolute means it cannot be open to other interpretations, cannot be undermined by new evidence. It is an objective part of reality. So I just wanted to highlight that before I end. Now, even Richard Dawkins, in his book A Devil's Chaplain, he agrees that the Darwinian mechanism, not the history of life, he believes that that can actually change. He says, we must acknowledge the possibility that new facts may come to light which will force our successors of the 21st century to abandon Darwinism or modify it beyond recognition. Now, I want you guys to make sure you understand this. It is the very beauty of science that its conclusions can change. That's the beauty of science. It's not actually a weakness. Because if it didn't change, we'd still be living in a clockwork mechanical universe. So the very fact that its conclusions can change is a good thing. Darwinian evolution is the current working model, is the current working paradigm, is the current working theory. And I have no problem with accepting it as a working hypothesis, working theory, working paradigm, working model. But it is not an absolute fact, for the same reason that no other scientific theory can be an absolute fact. So, just to summarize, it is speculative, it is based on assumptions, and there are disputes about its most fundamental ideas. I thank you very much for listening.
You timed that perfectly, my goodness. I was a little afraid of what alarm my children had recently set on my phone. I'm glad we didn't get a Disney song or something. But you forgot to tell us what you do in your free time when you're not debating. I'm going to let it slide for now, but later when we, be thinking. I'm going to call up next the competitor, Aron Ra. He is an atheist activist, a video blogger, a former Texas State Director of the American Atheists, former host of the Dogma Debate, host of the Raw Men, that makes me hungry, podcast. Thank you. Current president of Atheist Alliance of America and blogger for Reason Advocates on the Patheos Network. He's also heading the Phylogeny Explorer Project, an effort to render the entire evolutionary tree of life as a navigable online encyclopedia. Aron Ra first became known for his YouTube video series, The Foundational Falsehoods of Creationism, which has attracted over 20 million views and 142,000 subscribers to his YouTube channel, and resulted in his recently published book of the same name, which we've heard so much about. Thank you. And here you go.
Thank you very much. I don't do anything in my off time. I just work. I'm determined to be like the hardest working activist in atheism, and I'm well on my way. So, I have a slight PowerPoint here, and I apologize that so much of this presentation is going to have to be on semantics, it seems. because it is my opinion that my opponent is at a disadvantage in that he doesn't really understand the words that he's using. His argument depends on erroneously redefining terms and also quote mining academics out of context, not so much in taking the sentence out of the paragraph, but in not understanding the meaning surrounding what they're saying. So is this working? Okay, good. I never trust these things. Right, the term Darwinism means something different here in the U.S. than it means in the U.K. American scientists wouldn't use the word Darwinism at all. American historians might, but only if they're talking about Darwin's own postulations. Natural selection, sexual selection are the Darwinian mechanisms because it was Darwin who first proposed them. But if you look at these last 3 lines, you'll see that among senior British scientists, the word Darwinism is just a synonym for biological evolution, meaning that the 2 words mean exactly the same thing in the UK, as anyone can see if you just look it up. Professor Richard Dawkins gives an example of where British and American scientists agree that Darwinian evolution is contrasted against Lamarckian evolution, based on the mechanisms that Darwin first proposed and which have since been confirmed. And Subboor has already conceded that these are a matter of actual fact. In the American understanding of that word, Lamarck's theory couldn't pass the test, but Darwin's did, and was replaced by Darwinian theory, which was then synthesized with genetic theory to become the modern synthesis. The Mendelo-Darwinian synthesis is also called Neo-Darwinism, and is distinguished from Darwinism being limited to Darwin's own 19th century understanding. So when he says the word Darwinism, to me, I'm hearing what they knew in the 1800s, and nothing more than that. So, Subboor does not want to accept that additional mechanisms have been discovered and integrated. He talks about there being completely new theories that are supposed to challenge the original theory. No. These are new theories that are being integrated with the original mechanisms. These started with genetic drift and moved into endosymbiosis and epigenetics and a number of others. These and other discoveries in cell theory have contributed to an even more robust version of evolution, which was recently announced, very recently announced, by the Royal Society in London, in which they had an argument very much like what he's talking about, where you had scientists fighting with each other over whether they're going to accept Neo-Darwinism. They were hating on Neo-Darwinism. They want to come up with this whole new theory. And other scientists are arguing, but there's no substance to what you're talking about. It's not worth a whole new theory. It's just an extension. And I had to read up on as much of it as I could. I tried to invite some of these people for a podcast, but I haven't been able to get anybody who will be willing to talk to me about it. They closed the hearing for the public. But I did read some of the things that they're proposing. Not worth a whole nother theory, but okay, they want to integrate some other things, which is fine. And they call this the extended evolutionary synthesis, being an extension of Neo-Darwinism, which was itself an extension of Darwinism. And note that when Neo-Darwinism is criticized, Darwinism remains intact. There are some people at this conference who are proposing or proponents of intelligent design who said that they thought Darwinism was more accurate back in Darwin's day. Now their opinion is irrelevant. I just show it to illustrate that they're making a distinction between Darwinism and Neo-Darwinism. And as again, we don't use those words here. And so anyone who has taught Darwinism in American high school is probably too old to still be alive. What you learned in high school was not Darwinism, but Neo-Darwinism. Unless your professor was a silver-haired Englishman, in which case all post-Lamarckian concepts and mechanisms might have been called Darwinian. And where was I? Oh yeah. Okay, your kids will be taught the extended evolutionary synthesis, I think it is. Okay, so Subboor says that evolution, and he went into detail in an earlier video, and this is what I'm responding to. He said that evolution is something that is not controversial because it is limited to observable changes within a single species that can be seen in one lifetime. But he says that Darwinism is a history of biodiversity from a universal common ancestor that takes millions or billions of years. So what he's done, although he doesn't seem to realize this yet, is he has conflated evolution with microevolution and Darwinism with macroevolution. Now, he didn't call it macroevolution, which would have been easy to disprove. Just pull up a documented speciation. But since he's using the wrong definitions for the wrong terms, it gets vague and hard to identify exactly what he thinks he's talking about. Once we correct those terms, those of you who have read my book will recognize this as the 11th foundational falsehood of creationism, where creationists will accept small-scale evolution because it's too obvious to deny, but they'll say that large-scale evolution is unobservable and therefore merely a belief. And Subboor's use of deceptively vague or ambiguous language is equivocation, which amusingly is what he accused me of at this very point. But he's the one who's using the words incorrectly. Okay. These words Darwinism never meant what he thought it does. If you're talking to scientists of yesteryear, he got these two confused. So if you're talking to scientists of yesteryear, they would have said that Darwinism, if they're talking about Darwinism, they would have talked about the first one, not the second. And if you talk to modern scientists, when they say evolution, they mean both of these, right? With natural selection and all of the other identified mechanisms combined. Now, when the National Academy of Science made their official announcement that evolution was both a theory and a fact, they specified that they meant both present and past. And they were talking about, among other things, what goes on now and also transitional species that existed hundreds of millions of years ago. So they're talking about both micro and macro. And this is what Subboor meant when he misused the word Darwinian or Darwinism. Subboor said that science should be revisable, which it is. And what he calls Darwinian evolution is no exception in that it too can be and has been revised, altered, corrected, improved, and updated. But he thinks that revisable means it can be completely overturned. Refuted seems to be the word that he's looking for. And that's just not the case. And if reading the definition isn't enough to prove that, we'll just look at the article. Here we see that the formal scientific definition of theory refers to a comprehensive explanation of some aspect of nature that is supported by a vast body of evidence, and that many scientific theories are so well established that no new evidence is likely to alter them substantially. Now, he mentions some that have been refuted. We're talking about well-established ones now. We're not talking about phlogiston. We're not talking about vitalism. There are a whole bunch of theories that have failed over time. But we're talking about the ones that have withstood more than a century of hard testing by the smartest people on the planet. Now, these, if I may quote, they say, no new evidence will demonstrate that the Earth does not orbit around the sun. That's heliocentric theory. Or that living things are not made of cells, cell theory, or that matter is not composed of atoms, which is atomic theory, or that the surface of the Earth is not divided into solid plates that have moved over geologic timescales, which is, of course, the theory of plate tectonics. Like these and other foundational scientific theories, the theory of evolution is supported by so many... Oh, what do you know? Shut up. Yeah, I'm the only one that doesn't turn off my phone because I think people know better. All right. All right, so where was I reading this? Assumptions, let's see. That's right. Like these other foundational scientific theories, the theory of evolution is supported by so many observations and confirming experiments rather than speculative assumptions that scientists are confident that the basic components of the theory will not be overturned by new evidence, end quote. And let me see if I can go to the next one. And this is where we have to explain what a fact is. Here are definitions from Merriam-Webster, one from Wikipedia, and one from the National Center for Science Education. Now, if Subboor does not like the caveat that the NCSE tacked on the end of theirs, that's fine. I don't like it either. But it disproves his point that facts are supposed to be absolute. They're not. But if you remove the word absolute, then he and I may agree that the truth is what the facts are, because the truth is identified or defined as what can be shown to be true or concordant with reality, and a fact is a point of data which is either not in dispute or is indisputable in that it is objectively verifiable. Whichever way you like it, whatever wording you prefer, a fact is information that can be confirmed correct. Now, referring to the National Academy of Science again, we read that in science, a fact typically refers to an observation, measurement, or other form of evidence that can be expected to occur the same way under similar circumstances. However, and this is important, because in the video that he was talking about before, he distinguished the mechanisms of evolution from the explanation of evolution. And it's the explanation that he called Darwinism, right? And he said that this is not a fact, because it has to be absolute, which of course it doesn't have to be absolute. And he says you can have the mechanism be a fact, but the theory cannot be a fact. But here, the term fact also refers to a scientific explanation that has been tested and confirmed so many times that there's no longer a compelling reason to keep testing or looking for additional examples, meaning that it has been sufficiently proven in the colloquial sense. And it's important to understand when we're talking about, when you use the word proof, you have to specify what you mean, because we all know that science doesn't prove anything except in mathematics, right? So if we use the word proof, we have to understand we're using a legal term, wherein it's an overwhelming preponderance of evidence to establish a case or so forth. So in that respect, the past and continuing occurrence, referring to both micro and macro here, of evolution is a scientific fact. Because the evidence supporting it is so strong, scientists no longer question whether biological evolution has occurred and is continuing to occur. So now they study how it happened and not so much if it happened, because that question has already been answered. And I could rest my case right here, but I wouldn't just use an argument from authority. I mean, I did write a book on this. I mean, I have some idea about how to explain this just by citing and explaining the data. So, like he's mentioned before, he took part of a quote. It is a fact that evolution happens, that biodiversity and complexity do increase, and that both occur naturally only by evolutionary means. It is a fact that alleles vary with increasing distinction in reproductive populations, and that these are accelerated in genetically isolated groups. It is a fact that natural selection, sexual selection, and genetic drift have all been proven to have predictable effect in guiding this variance. If you accept microevolution, you have no excuse to reject macroevolution, because it's a continuation of the same process. If you can walk 20 feet, then given more time and provisions, you can walk 20 miles. It is a fact that significant beneficial mutations do occur and are inherited by descendant groups, and that multiple independent sets of biological markers exist to trace these lineages backwards over many generations, and this is one of the many facts establishing the fact of human evolutionary ancestry. It is a fact that the collective genome of all animals has been traced to its most basal form through reverse sequencing, and that those forms are indicated by comparative morphology, physiology, and embryological development, in addition to chronologically correct placement in the geologic column in successive stages. It is also a fact that every animal on Earth, as he mentioned before, has definite relatives either living nearby or in the fossil record. There are ways of establishing this hierarchy of arrangement, and it was done 300 years ago. So it doesn't take a whole lot of technology to figure this out. There's the simple game of Sesame Street. One of these things is not like the other. That's all that you need, really, to establish this kind of a hierarchy. And importantly, it is also a fact that both microevolution and macroevolution have been observed and documented dozens of times, both in the lab and in naturally controlled conditions in the field. And that all of these have withstood critical analysis and peer review, and I have citations for some of these in my book. We don't know everything, but we know a lot about this. And what we know, we actually know, and can show that we got it right. Which brings me to another thing I need to bring up. Subboor hosts a YouTube channel called Darwinian Delusions. And the idea that he calls us Darwinists delusional may seem like an empty insult, but it is also a logical fallacy of psychological projection. He is projecting his own faults onto those who will not share them. The psychiatric definition of a delusion is a persistent false belief that is maintained despite indisputable evidence to the contrary, to falsely claim something when there is evidence otherwise. And it is a delusion because the beliefs remain fixed even when the facts are against them. There is no actual fact that contradicts evolution. But if there was, we would simply have to consider it and change our minds or adjust our perception accordingly. Because we just want to understand the way things really are and improve on that understanding. We don't have a commitment to preserve or defend the belief whether it's true or not, which Subboor does. And this is why he will continue to believe what he believes, even when all the facts are against it. Because creationist organizations post statements of faith as if this were something to be proud of, wherein they admit that they will never acknowledge any evidence against them. These are confessions that they have already rejected. And you notice these are all from leading creationist organizations. These are confessions that they have already rejected all the evidence there could ever be, such that no matter how wrong they are, no amount of proof will ever change their minds. Their beliefs are assumed without reason and defended against all reason. Not one scientific organization or institution would agree to anything so intellectually dishonest as this, because it's not the Darwinists who are delusional. Yet, this is a typical, even common admission among creationists, because creationism literally is a delusion by definition, because it is a persistent false belief that will not change despite evidence to the contrary. And as you can see here, they even admit that. And Subboor has admitted it too. In a video that I responded to, he said that he thinks there's nothing wrong with ignoring evidence in order to preserve a preferred assumption. But there is something wrong with that. It is dishonest to assert as fact that which is not evidently true, yet that's what all religions do. But it's even worse, as if that wouldn't bad enough, it's even worse to then also say that you will never admit when you're wrong. It ruins your reputation, counts against your honor and your credibility, and nullifies your word because it shows that you don't care what the truth is, even in an avenue where accuracy and accountability are paramount. Subboor wants to believe that what he calls Darwinism is based on assumptions, and he imagines that its most fundamental ideas have been disputed. But, of course, Darwin based his theory not on assumptions, but on observations by biologists and geologists who came before him, and on his own extensive observations around the world, comparing variations within species to variations between species and reproductive variables, and studying geology, and studying, paleontology, and so forth. And, of course, phylogeny. And his theory was tested and researched for decades before it was published. And it provided the only explanation ever for the daughter sets descending from a branching hierarchy of ancestral parent clades that was discovered by Carolus Linnaeus a century before him when he tried his classification of life forms. Subboor says it's not necessary that we have an explanation for some things, and maybe he's technically correct on some matters, but we do have this one mystery that Carolus Linnaeus could never answer, and that no one could answer until Darwin. He had the one thing that made everything make sense. And while he says that the tree of life has never been verified or is now in dispute, as director of the Phylogeny Explorer Project, I find that quite a surprise. Because I have this huge database that's going to be worked on by scientists around the world, and I don't think I'm going to hear that, this isn't real, right? I'm getting concrete confirmation from everywhere about this. So, no, evolution is definitely not based on assumptions. Like every other scientific theory, evolution is based on observable phenomena and testable hypotheses. Natural selection has since been demonstrated. Each of the transitional species Darwin predicted have been found. And his idea of an interrelated tree of life has been verified again and again and again by many different ways. These are the most fundamental ideas of Darwinian theory, and there is a consensus confirming each of them. There's some question as to how extensive some of these can be, but there is no question and absolutely no dispute of the factual reality of any of them. Subboor wants to make believe that evolution is speculative, meaning that it's based on conjecture rather than actual knowledge. But no, this too is demonstrably, verifiably, obviously, absolutely wrong. Evolution is and always was based on what we know and can show and can prove, even to Subboor's satisfaction. What creationists call Darwinism and scientists call evolution is a verifiable, inescapable fact of population genetics, and a paleontological and phylogenetic certainty that is consistently, continuously, conclusively confirmed for a fact.
That's your time.
Thank you.
Great job so far, guys. I thought about taking a poll to see how we think they're doing, but I thought we'd wait at least until after the rebuttals. So the rebuttals are 10 minutes apiece. Are you ready? Do you want me to vamp a little bit? Do you need any more time? Because I have stories I can tell, jokes, songs, dances. All right. Subboor, welcome back up. Do you want a 2-minute warning before you're done?
Yeah.
Yeah?
You
Okay.
could let me slip a few extra minutes. Okay, in the name of God, the Lord of mercy, the giver of mercy. Now, I knew we were going to get into technicalities, so that's why I defined what a fact meant. Now, Aaron said this is what a fact is, and he just explained what it was. Now, there's a big problem with that. That's a misunderstanding of basically basic philosophy, because fact has multiple meanings. Now, right at the beginning, he said, no, this is what a fact means, and this is what I mean, and blah, 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 blah. There's no point getting into that discussion, because you have to define a term before you actually use it, and there are multiple meanings of it. There's not just one meaning. And I knew we were going to get into this, so I got this from the Cambridge website. There's a philosophy paper on, is the definition of fact the first problem of philosophy? And yes, it is. And what it does is it makes a recommendation. A word of universal use carrying such different meanings cannot be used in a rational thinking and argument without causing immense confusion. That is why all who hope to use reason fruitfully must make it their first duty to agree upon a clear definition of the word fact. So first falsehood, because that's his favorite word, is there are multiple meanings, there's not just one meaning. And my original video, which Aaron responded to, this is the same way I defined fact in that video, which he responded to. And I came here today again, and I used those definitions. Now, if you don't want to agree to those definitions, and that definition was, it doesn't change, it is certain, it is absolute. So if you want to challenge that definition, it shows you believe it can change, it is not absolute, and it is not certain. One thing I just wanted to get this out of the way. Whenever I quoted you, I always quoted you word to word, but you made a claim, which I don't believe I said that, about the assumption that I won't change my belief if something or whatever. So you need to actually tell me what I said there, just to clarify. Okay, you spoke about the extended synthesis, right? So I'm very surprised you said they're incorporating these ideas. I have the extended synthesis. I'm aware of all these topics, and I'm very surprised you actually made that claim, because Masayoshi Nye is an ardent anti-Darwinist in the sense of the mechanism, and he says, you know, Darwin's become a god, right? Because he's angry at that, and that it's basically like a belief system, right? It's a dogma, and that needs to be challenged. So I'm very surprised you said that that's in the extended synthesis. I'd like you to show me how it is. I mean, Masayoshi and I wouldn't really agree with that. Why would Oxford University have a book on it if it was just like pseudoscience? Okay. Secondly, you spoke about you spoke about all these ideas. They can be incorporated within Darwinism. Now, clearly, Masayoshi Nye's ideas can't. And if they could, why would they have such a thing as the third way of evolution? James Shapiro, he believes, and the evolutionary biologist who came up with evolution by natural genetic engineering, he clearly said Darwinism is a philosophical belief, right? More than science. He doesn't believe in God. He doesn't believe in creationism or anything like that. And he challenges it. So I'm very, very surprised you believe that these ideas can be put back into Darwinism. Now, you brought up Wikipedia and you said the definition of Darwinism in the US and the UK is different. Sorry, I'm just not going to accept that. That's just the silliest thing I've heard in the last 10 minutes. Right? It's a duty upon you to do your research properly. So let me just give you one example, and this is just off the top of my head. Right? I can give you many other examples. One example. So no one uses the word Darwinism anymore. Okay, Oxford University just published a book last month called Darwinism as Religion. Right? Okay. There's also, that's by the atheist philosopher of science Michael Ruse. There's many books on this. Okay, I agree. The word is old. Alfred Russel Wallace is the first guy to use the word Darwinism. It is not a derogatory term. It is not a. In fact, Michael Ruse, who actually wrote that book, he calls himself a Darwinist. He's actually proud. He actually believes in the Darwinian mechanism. So the whole idea of bringing up Wikipedia and bringing up, and also you brought up the National Science Foundation, and you said some interesting things, right? So, National Science Foundation, they are not a published peer-reviewed philosophical paper authority like the Journal of Theoretical Biology or other ones. How can you use them as an authority? And they basically, you quoted off their website, and they said, no new facts can come to light that will challenge. I'm assuming you're referring to universal common ancestry. Okay, so that's really quite interesting, and I'm going to get into that because you, and I don't want to misquote you here, you said it was an absolute fact. You reconfirmed that universal common ancestry is an absolute fact, didn't you?
I said that in the article they wrote.
No, what do you believe?
What?
What, do you believe universal common ancestry and the tree of life is a fact?
It can be confirmed, yes.
Okay, and you said it was as easy as Sesame Street.
Except, I don't like to use the word absolute.
Sure.
Until we have...
No, that's fine, that's fine, that's fine. Okay, so let's first get into that, right? Because I thought that was really interesting. Okay, universal common ancestry. Aaron used the example of Sesame Street. I love Sesame Street. I was born in the 80s, right? I have nothing against Bertie, right? Even though he's got a horrible haircut. The fact of the matter is, you can't use a very simple, trivial thing like, look at them, they look similar, so they must have a common ancestor. And I knew this was going to come up. This is why I brought some books with me, right? Okay, universal common ancestry is based upon a probabilistic framework which has assumptions, and they are conceptual problems. Aaron called it an absolute fact. Okay. Now, I bought the full paper just in case Aaron thinks I'm misquoting, because I thought he was going to make that claim. This is a formal test of the theory of universal common ancestry, right? And it clearly says it has it's rarely been subjected to formal quantitative testing, and is difficult, technically difficult in empirically evaluating a theory of such a broad scope. So it's not an absolute fact, it is a theory. If it was, then why would people be writing papers about it and saying these particular things? Secondly, this is the Journal of Theoretical Biology testing the hypothesis of common ancestry. This is what it says. The hypothesis that all of life on Earth, and remember him in his book, this book right here, which I'm promoting, I think you should give me some some money for that, right? The hypothesis that all life on Earth traces back to a single common ancestor, which you called an absolute fact and equivalent to reality tonight.
I never said that.
Okay. The hypothesis that all of life traces back to a single common ancestor is a fundamental postulate in evolutionary theory. Yet, despite its widespread acceptance in biology, there has been comparatively little evidence to formally testing this hypothesis of common ancestry. And it goes on and it mentions the same thing the Nature article does, which is that there's intrinsic difficulties. And I highlighted this for you right in the beginning, so I thought you were going to make this mistake. There is actually a section on this, which is about why a past may be unknowable, which is what I was referring to when I said speculative. So, when it comes to oh my God, okay. When it comes to universal common ancestry, right, Aaron made some very interesting claims, okay? Sesame Street, that's ridiculous. Try and find a evolutionary biologist that's going to agree with that, or philosopher of science that's going to agree with that. I'm just going to highlight two books here. This is Evidence in Evolution by Cambridge University, and this is Parsimony, Phylogeny and Genomics by Oxford University. This is what the books agree about. Universal common ancestry is based on a probabilistic framework which has assumptions, and there's conceptual problems. So let's look at Aron's Sesame Street example, and let's look at what they say. Universal common ancestry and separate ancestry are testable hypotheses. Nothing about Sesame Street so far. Claiming homology, which is similarity due to common descent, your Sesame Street example. Claiming homology is a fact, and then testing it using, and then testing universal common ancestry versus separate ancestry is circular reasoning. Another thing they agree about, homology is a fundamental assumption of universal common ancestry. Similarities and dissimilarities should be put within a probabilistic framework. Homoplasy, which is similarities not due to common descent, is also an assumption and is assumed to exist and complicates the assumption of homology, the Sesame Street example. Ad hoc hypotheses can't be eliminated in the universal common ancestry hypothesis, but have to be minimized. But here's something they do agree about. Both the following thoughts are naive, and I'm quoting word to word, just in case you say I've misquoted them. Humans and chimps must share a common ancestor because they are so similar, and humans and mushrooms must have arisen independently because they are so different. Within a probabilistic framework, there is no must in either case. You're not going to find words absolute fact and reality denial. One last thing, if I'm allowed to say. You were upset about the phylogeny and the tree of life. Keep your tree of life, no problem. But the issue is, I am not challenging it and saying, oh, I don't like your tree, therefore I'm challenging it. Princeton University, philosopher of science, Peter Godfrey Smith, he's speaking about biologists are moving away from the tree of life to the web of life. So if you've got, something to say, you should go speak to those people. And remember, every single person I'm referring to are mainstream evolutionary biologists and philosophers of science. I'm not referring to Bertie.
Oh, nice. I thought I was going to have to get my hook out and pull you off. But, all right, this is pretty good. Are you ready? Or do you need me to vamp? All right, come on up. 10 minutes. Do you want me to give you a 2-minute warning?
No.
Okay.
Well, yeah, let me know when to shut up.
Oh, I will.
All right. When I gave the definition of a fact, how many definitions did I put up on the board? At least a half a dozen, or was it more? Right? I verified all the definitive sources I could find. Right? Scientific sources, mainstream colloquial sources, whatever. And I showed that all of these definitions agreed. Right? We had that on the wall. I know it was behind his head. I should have told him to turn around and look because he said I didn't verify my definitions. What he said, since he wanted clarification of this, in his video that I was responding to, he said something about these scientists that were comparing the human genome and the chimpanzee genome, and they found very few letters, as he put them, that matched, and that they found billions of letters that didn't match, so they just ignored them. And he said, there's nothing wrong with that, because they assumed that their perspective is okay, or that their perspective is true, and so anything that doesn't match that, they can have confirmation bias. He didn't use the word confirmation bias, but he explained confirmation bias. You can just ignore all that doesn't match. And when I made the video to address that, I put text above his head to say, and probably he should have watched the whole video before making a public debate about it, where it said, you think it's okay to ignore evidence for a preferred assumption? Because I thought that was quite an admission to make. And of course, scientists wouldn't do that. Conclusions can change, as we've established, and in the definitions from the scientific sites that I showed, they said it can, but that there are some that are so well established that they are considered fact, that these things are not going to change. And in the video that I originally addressed, he gave 2 different definitions for fact. One of them, he said, being absolute, right, which we know the definition of absolute is not in there, but the Earth going around the sun was one of his facts, that it would be absolute, that evolution is not going to be that way. So one of the things that I brought up is whether we're ever going to find evidence that Earth doesn't go around the sun. Can we be absolutely certain about that? Nobody can be absolutely certain about anything, but if we understand the laws of nature, we understand the laws of physics within this reality, unless this is a matrix illusion, if we all agree that reality is real by definition, there are some things we can be absolutely certain about, right? Some things. I try to be very hesitant when I use that word, and I'm not going to use it for fact, because we know what the definition is, and it's whether something can be verified. And everything that I've been talking about so far tonight are things that we can definitely verify. Thank you for proving my point when you mentioned that nobody uses the word Darwinism anymore. I did say nobody in America, but that they still do in England. So he uses the example, yeah, there's somebody that does it. It's this guy from Oxford. What country is that? Thank you. You proved my point. And phylogeny has rarely been tested? No, phylogeny is constantly tested. They're doing whole genome searches every day now. It took years to do the first one. It took another year or more to do the second one, and then they started picking up their speed. And they've got computers that will now do this constantly. We have a lot of corrections in phylogenies now, which we weren't expecting before, when they used to do things by morphology. So how do I use Sesame Street for morphology? Because you can't use the simple analysis of different morphological traits to come up with a common ancestor. I didn't say that. I said you can figure out the hierarchy. Carolus Linnaeus figured out this huge quandary because he was expecting that he was going to show created kinds when he started classifying life forms. But he found this set of Matryoshka dolls, the Russian dolls, one doll inside the other, except that each doll has 4 dolls inside it. Something like that on average. So why, or at least 2. Let's go with the analogy of the 2. Every doll has 2 dolls in it, and then every other doll, and they branch. Why? That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't fit with creation. He never thought about the idea of a common ancestor because he thought they were created. But he used the Sesame Street method to build this tree of life, and then had a quandary to try to figure out, how could this be? And he challenged the scientific community to explain to him how we are not apes, or that apes are not people, because he classified them as both. And the scientific community, also unable to explain that at the time, decided to make an arbitrary, contrived classification called genus Pongo, which they put all of the non-human apes in. But if you have to say, that all of them except us, that's kind of a Freudian admission that you already realize we should be in that set. And it wasn't until about 20 years ago that genetics finally confirmed conclusively, and if I may say so, absolutely, that humans are in fact apes. That we are apes both by definition and derivation, genetically and morphologically. It's a twin-nested hierarchy. We can now check the morphology, and sometimes we get it right. Most of the time we get it right, just looking at the traits. But there's sometimes we didn't get it right, and the genes showed, nope, it's on this branch, not this one. So there are corrections that we've discovered from this, because we now have a way of doing a paternity test on all of our distant ancestors. And these are all things that he doesn't want to accept. And I'm sorry, Subboor, but you've given all these citations of things that you don't understand. Like the bush of life, the web of life. The bush of life, that's my argument. I said that the tree of life is really a tumbleweed. And because of horizontal gene transfer, they're not trying to replace the tree of life with the web of life. The tree of life applies only to eukaryotes. And it may be deeply divided between plants and animals. But the tree of life, if it's one tree or 2 trees, we're not entirely certain. I think it's 1 tree. But it starts with an embryo. Well, we're not going to get into that. But anyway, let's just say 1 tree that forks early on, that rises out of a web. I don't believe in a single universal common ancestor. I don't. Yeah. For all animals, yes. That we have a common ancestor with apes? Absolutely. But not for all life. All life emerged separately, in pieces, and incrementally, and started gathering together. This is one of the things that endosymbiosis has shown us. Your cells, most of your body is actually bacterial. Most of your cells are not your cells. And all of your cells are powered by bacteria. There's a rickettsia bacteria, which is normally parasitic, normally cause rickets. But there's a type of bacteria, that you know it better as mitochondria, that was apparently trapped, disabled rickettsia, invades the cell, does damage to the cell, takes off. But if it's disabled where it can't take off again, then the cell takes it over and starts using its ability to generate energy. So it starts generating ATP, and then when the cell splits, the rickettsia splits separately. And plants also, they have they're what they call the chlorophyll. This actually cyanobacteria. Again, this is bacteria inside eukaryote cells. So we don't come from one source. We come from multiple sources at the beginning of the tree, but then from then on, we can chart a full tree of life. And I think I'm done.
Wow. You have 2 minutes left if you want them.
Yeah, let me see. Oh yeah, Subboor has this position that he is aware of things like transitional species, like Australopithecus, for example, which can't be explained and were predicted and fulfilled the predictions of science, but he chooses to ignore them. He'll make a statement, he'll try to discredit it, and he'll say there is no missing link. I'm sorry, there was a prediction made in the 1800s. That prediction was satisfied in 1974. You should at least acknowledge that, hey, it was predicted and found. Don't just ignore it. Don't say it never existed. That's not honest. Evolution is not based on assumptions. There is no dispute of the fundamental ideas of Darwinian theory, and it damn sure is not speculative. This is based on shit we know.
I'll go ahead and just stay here because the next portion of our evening is the one-on-one, which I'm a little afraid to be between you guys, but maybe that's the whole point. So we're going to take 20 minutes and just let you guys kind of go at each other, but if I notice either of you is being a hog with the time, then I reserve the right to shush you and let the other one go. But I think we're all ready to go. We got the boxing gloves, as it were, and I'm going to start the timer and let you guys talk.
Okay. So thanks for your, I think it was a rebuttal. So you said that, you know, humans and chimps, like, it's an absolute fact that we have a common ancestor.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just going to read out here from here, read it out directly. I'm not going to paraphrase it, and I want you to tell me whether that's in line with what you just said. The following thoughts are naive. Humans and chimps must share a common ancestor because they are so similar, Sesame Street. And humans and mushrooms must have arisen independently because they are so different. Within a probabilistic framework, there is no must in either case. Now, I'm very surprised that even though I bought 2 books here, and I mentioned to you, they're saying it's based on a probabilistic framework, based upon assumptions, and there's conceptual problems such as homology being a fundamental assumption in a non-circular way, and the problem of homoplazy, none of which is mentioned in your book, which what is mentioned is the Sesame Street type thinking. How can you continue to say humans and chimps must have a common ancestor and it's absolute when people like Cambridge University, Oxford University disagree with you?
They don't disagree with me. That's the thing.
Okay.
You keep citing experts that you think disagree with me, and they don't. I can show you that they don't. You cited Craig Venter as supposedly disagreeing with me. No, I knew exactly.
I never mentioned Craig Venter.
Not here. In another video that I rebutted that you weren't paying attention to, you cited Craig Venter as disagreeing with me, and I explained there. No, this is what Craig Venter was talking about. You didn't understand it. You don't understand any of the experts you're talking about. I don't say that it must be because of this one reason. No. Why do chimpanzees and humans have a common ancestor? Because we have the genetic confirmation for it. We have the genetic code to prove it. It's not just on morphology, it's also on genetics.
Okay. This book, when it's actually referring to this thing that within a probabilistic framework there is no must, it refers to physiology, morphology, and genetics.
Mm-hmm. So, you asked me a question that the way the question was phrased is nonsense. I corrected the question and gave the correct answer.
So, what you said previously, before you came down, was it's an absolute fact that they have a common ancestor.
Yes.
Okay? This book doesn't say that.
No, it doesn't say that. It says another thing that you said it must be because they're so similar. That would be ridiculous.
No.
Let's extend that, and it's not because they're so similar. It's because we have the genetic confirmation of it.
And I don't know whether you're not listening to this or you don't want to listen to this. It literally says to say they have a common ancestor is...
Okay, I'll explain it to
wait,
you
one
again.
second.
Start
Within a
again.
probabilistic framework, one second, so I just want to quote it directly. Within a probabilistic framework, there is no must in either case.
Right.
Both these books, they treat common ancestry and separate ancestry as testable hypotheses. They treat homology, similarities due to common descent,
Right.
Sesame Street example, as a probabilistic framework which has assumptions, which has problems. Okay?
Right.
I'm assuming you haven't read these 2 books because none of this was in your book, right?
Right, I did not
Until
read
now,
this.
I'm reading direct quote to you,
Which
and
doesn't
you're just
help
not
your case.
acknowledging. You're just
And
not
it-
acknowledging it.
I can't because what you read doesn't help your case, and you don't understand that. You
Okay,
said
have you read
that
this book?
chimpanzees and humans must have a common ancestor. It would be ridiculous to say that humans and chimpanzees must have a common ancestor because they're so similar. Yes, that sentence is correct, and that's not why I say they have a common ancestor. I said because within the last 20 years or so, we finally got the genetic confirmation to prove it. It has nothing to do with that sentence.
This book is referring to genetics, morphology, and physiology.
But that's not the
And
sentence you got, is it?
It is.
The sentence you got says nothing
Okay,
about
have you read
genetics.
this book? Have you
No,
even got
I
this
have-
book?
Did
So
you
how
read
can you
that
say I'm
sentence?
misquoting it? I read the whole thing.
if you read that book, if you read that sentence, tell me where the word genetics or anything implying genetics shows up in that sentence.
Perfect. Okay. Can we, if it does, would you admit you're wrong?
If the word genetics or something implying genetics shows up in that book,
Yep.
yeah, read me
Okay,
the same sentence
okay,
again. Let's see if
okay.
any new words pop up.
Okay. I didn't read the whole sentence because of the size of it. And you can
Okay.
see I've highlighted it here, right? Let me know when it does mention genetics. Much is
The
made...
sentence you read to me did not have genetics in it. You said that you can't say that they have, or that you should, there's no must.
Now you're
because you
changing the
can't say-
goalposts. Can I read
I'm
it?
not.
Can I
I'm
read
not.
it?
I said the
Can I
sentence
read
you
it first?
read.
Can I read it first?
I said the sentence you read did not, it was correct, that it didn't make sense. There is no must, that it is not because they have, that they're
Okay,
similar to
forget
each
that
other.
for now. Can I read it?
Go ahead.
Much is made in the popular press of the fact that DNA sequences of humans and chimps are about 98% similar. Is this similarity compelling evidence that we and chimps share a common ancestor? Since each site in the sequence is characterized by 4 nucleotides, we have here a set of 4 state, not decomatous characters, but the point about the process of generating the data is the same. The expected percentage similarity of humans and chimps, according to the separate ancestry hypothesis, would be 25% if each site evolved independently by the process of random genetic drift. And the lineages have been evolving for a long time. In this case, the observed similarity of 98% would strongly favor common ancestry over separate ancestry. However, if there was a strong selection in each lineage for the traits that one observes, the expected degree of similarity would be about the same, regardless of whether the common ancestry or the separate ancestry hypothesis is true. And then it mentions the sentence that I mentioned. So it's within the context of genetics, physiology, and morphology.
And it doesn't mention anything that was discovered since 1974. We already knew that.
You're going off on a tangent now.
What tangent?
You're talking about something else now.
No, I'm not.
You said this wasn't
You're
referring to
interrupting
genetics.
before
I
you
showed you it was
understand what
referring
I-
to genetics.
Right, you're interrupting before I make the
Sorry,
point,
sorry,
which is
sorry.
not a tangent, it's on the same thing.
Okay.
I did tell you that it was just in the last 20 years that we had confirmation of this. We did know in 1974 that we had this 1 or 6% similarity, depending on how you measure it. But that wasn't the conclusive factor. It was the human chimp genome number 2 that was the conclusive factor.
They're not saying it's a conclusive factor. They're saying
I know that.
that's fine. So we agree there. We agree it's not
On
conclusive.
what? We
You-
agree that
you
you
said
don't
it was an
understand that
absolute
it's not
fact.
that that argument doesn't help you.
No, you said it was an absolute fact, and according to mainstream academics,
It is.
it's based on a probabilistic framework which has assumptions and conceptual
Except-
problems like homology, homoplasy, and the
Except that it didn't bring up the conclusive factor that I just mentioned.
Oh,
It
so
brought up what
you
they
need to
knew in
update Cambridge
1974.
University then.
It brought up what they knew in 1974, but didn't bring up what they knew in 1994.
Okay, it's interesting. This book was published in 2008, so
So?
Cambridge University isn't up to date.
It's not my fault that they don't include the conclusive factor. You said
need to
you said it was a biased work already. You said it was already somebody that doesn't agree with it. So of course he's not going to explain how the human genome
Wait, no,
number 2 is a factor.
Hang on one second. Elliot Sober believes in human chimp ancestry, right?
He does?
He does.
Okay. Well, I thought you said he didn't.
No,
Does-
he
okay.
does. He does.
Okay.
What else do you have to say? Because you're saying it's an absolute fact, and it's not.
Why is
We
it not?
agreed upon that.
So human chimp genome number 2 doesn't exist because it didn't show up in that paragraph?
Hang on a second.
The conclusive factor
Hang on.
not mentioned there doesn't exist because it's not
No,
mentioned there?
no. You're saying it's...
Or the guy's expertise is in question
Okay.
because he failed to mention that?
Let's just assume Cambridge University don't know what they're talking about, right? Okay, that's fine.
Well, how about let's bring up something relevant?
One second. You're still referring to homology, are you not?
No, I wasn't at all.
So the Sesame Street
The
example
Sesame
was...
Street was homology, yes.
Yes.
And that's not the reason. That's why your sentence didn't make any sense.
So-
That's why I had to correct it, because it wasn't about homology.
So your book goes and mentions homology many times, right? Throughout the book.
Right.
What I found surprising, no homoplasy. No discussion of the fact that it is a probabilistic framework based on some assumptions, and there are conceptual problems. And not once, and this is what I found really shocking, not once did you actually explain that to assume homology and then say two things are similar, therefore they must have a common ancestor, this is circular reasoning.
I never said anything like that.
No, what I'm saying is, why didn't you say that?
Why didn't I use a circular argument? Because I'm wise.
No. Wait, hang on a second.
I never said assume homology.
Wait, hang on. What do you mean? No, wait, hang on. You used homology, right?
I explained homology. I didn't say anybody should assume it.
Okay.
I never say anybody should assume anything.
Didn't you, there's a certain paragraph, actually. Let me just bring it up. There's a certain paragraph where you said, apes are so similar to us that, you know, if some of those ancient ape human ancestors were alive, you know, we wouldn't be able to classify them separately. You said that, right?
That is correct.
Is that homology?
Yes.
It is homology.
If you
Okay,
can't
fine.
distinguish,
Okay,
if
that's
you
fine.
can't distinguish a transitional person between the divergence, human divergence from chimps to modern man, if you can look at one of these people in this interremium and you can't tell if they're ape or if they're human, that's kind of the definitive characteristic of being transitional.
Okay, and that's
you look
homology.
at this person and you can't distinguish. Are they ape or are they human? This is why I brought up in that book that creationists were given a set of skulls to examine. There's actually one skull. Dwayne Gish identified this one skull cap as being 100% ape. Or I think it said it was 100% human the first time. And then they gave it to somebody else and they
What
said it
page
was
was
100%
that, by the way? It's gonna help me out.
I can't remember what page that was on. And then they gave it to another creationist, a third creationist, Ludau, I think, and he said it was 100% human. So we've got all this discrepancy. And then they give it back to Gish again, like 6 years later. And now what he said was 100% human, he now says is 100% ape. It's the same skull. He's just looking at the same skull again. So he puts it 100% on both sides of any category. And the other two guys didn't agree with each other either. So if you can't decide even what it is, then isn't that exactly what a transitional species is?
Okay, so you mentioned homology there clearly, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was used as proof of common descent,
No,
because you're assuming those apes are
No.
ancestors, correct?
no.
So what are you doing?
I'm saying, I'm just explaining a transitional species. If you encounter what people were asking for an ape man, right? And then they were given an ape man, they were given Homo erectus.
Yep.
Clearly, what they understood to be ape, according to that contrived, artificially constructed genus Pongo, right? If you have to put apes in one category and humans in another, well, then this one is one that's an ape man. And then they picked up thousands of other ones, thousands of individuals, a couple dozen species perhaps, of what they both ape and man. You can't tell them apart. This is before they get to genetics. We've already got where we have Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis, and early Homo erectus was all over the place, and they're all different sizes and shapes of them. They were way more diverse than modern people are.
Can I just interject?
What?
I've read the book, so you don't need to explain it again. You're using homology. My question is very particular.
Okay.
Let me ask the question, you can answer it.
Okay.
You mentioned homology, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you, at the end of the book, you had loads of facts in there. It's a fact that we have a common ancestor. It's a
Right.
fact there's definitive.
Right.
You can take the genomes and you can get a basal form. You said it's a fact. Yet, and I find this very strange, you didn't mention the fact that homology, and to use homology is, you have to use it within a probabilistic framework, which has assumptions, and they are conceptual problems. Not once did you mention that there is such a thing as homoplasy. And not once did you actually mention that there are conceptual problems within this, and this is based upon Bayesian decomposition with 9 mathematical assumptions, and then you get a probabilistic framework, and somebody who would be justified in actually saying universal common ancestry is probable. Yet under other conditions, as mentioned in this book, and he's an atheist by the way, he doesn't believe in God, under other assumptions, separate ancestry favors universal common ancestry, right? Now, if you mentioned that in your book, I would have no problem. And I have
I
no
did. I did explain about probabilistic, yes.
No, why did you call it a fact then?
Because in fact, it's not absolute.
Okay, that's good. You said that. Now I don't want
I
to
go with the definition that I provided in the book.
I don't want to
And that I
misquote you.
showed a consensus definition on the board.
Yep, that's fine.
It's a point of data that can be objectively verified.
Yep, that's fine. 1 second. Here we go.
And bear in mind, the book is dealing with creationist arguments,
Yep,
so
that's
I'm
fine.
attacking specific ones.
Yep, that's
I
fine.
did explain how science works, not with the type of certainty or assertion
Yep.
that religious beliefs have,
Yep.
but rather that You can speculate, you can make an assumption, but you have to negate it by testing it.
Okay.
It has to be based on evidence, and then it has to be testable and potentially falsifiable. And that you cannot make an unsupported assertion like you do in religion.
Okay, here are your words exactly. And if I misquote you, I'm going to give you this. We're recording everything so somebody can go online and find out. Right? It would be perverse to say taxonomical classification are a fantastically improbable accident of coincidence. That would be a statistical impossibility which reaches into the realm of reality denial. Okay? It is an absolute fact. That's what you said.
Yep. You have a qualifier that this fact is absolute. The word fact is not absolute. The definition of fact is not absolute.
know, it's just
But
a
some facts are absolute, and I just explained that 5 minutes ago.
Speaking of 5 minutes, that's how much you have left. 5 minutes.
So how would you explain that? You know, you make these predictions, or nobody predicted Homo erectus. That was a bit of a surprise, right? People found Neanderthalensis. That was a bit confusing. But then you get into Homo erectus, and now you find Homo erectus all over the place. You have the jutting brow, we have the 400 cc, we're a little bit bigger than that, maybe up to 1300, but it's a wide range. Wide range of heights and everything's displaced all over Asia and Africa and parts of Europe. How do you account for Homo habilis, Homo rudifensis, Homo floresiensis?
Homo naledi, yeah? I mean, what do you mean by that? Like, how do I account for it? As a Muslim?
How do you account for it?
You're asking as a Muslim, right? So,
I'm asking you.
yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm a Muslim, so I'll answer. I believe they exist.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to say, well, as a Libra, it doesn't matter. Just ask me the question and I'll answer it.
Yeah.
What is the answer? What do you think the answer
No,
is?
because you're asking a question without actually putting the actual question in there. It sounds like a question, but it's like, how do you account for it? How do you account for it in what terms? Because look, okay, let me answer it 2 ways. I'm going to answer it as a Muslim, not as a zebra, and also I'm going to answer it in context to this debate, right? Number one, anything that they find, Homo naledi, Homo erectus, whatever they find, to take those skulls and to take a line of fossils and to claim that this is a descendant of this, according to Henry Gee, an evolutionary biologist, just like all the rest of them, and an atheist, he says that it is not a scientific hypothesis that can be tested, but a bedtime story. You can't prove it with a fact. This is what Henry Gee says in his book, Misunderstandings of Human Evolution, right?
Let me give you an example.
Let me answer that question, right? So, if you're going to use similarities and say, therefore, common descent, then I'm just going to repeat the same thing like I did previously, like a parrot. That is based upon a probabilistic framework which has assumptions and there's conceptual problems, such as homoplazy, similarities which are not due to common descent. So if you're going to maintain the line of Sesame Street, similarities are due to common descent except when they're not.
And you missed the part where I explained homoplazy too.
Okay, let me answer, right? Secondly, and this is as a Muslim, right? Okay, these things existed. I mean, it's not a theological problem for us. I mean, theologically, look, if we're going to get into this, theologically, it's not even a problem if, somebody says, the whale evolved from some sort of land mammal. I mean, look, these things are irrelevant, right? When it comes to Islam, it's a religion in which we worship the one creator, we believe God is the cause behind all things. But when it goes into particular things about this might be an ancestor of this or this might be this particular thing, the way I think about it is, look, let the scientists do their work, right? That's why I accept it as a paradigm, I accept it as a model, I accept it as a theory. But the same reason I believe that it is not an absolute fact is the same reason why you believe string theory is not an absolute fact, because they're both scientific theories.
But the theory of evolution meets the definition of a fact, where string theory does not.
The way I defined fact at the beginning?
Oh, no. The way the world defines fact. The half a dozen different definitive definitions that I gave up there for what a fact is.
I'm going to give this to you as a present for you to read, right? There is no consensus on this. This is why it gives you the piece of advice, and this is why I knew this was going to come up. It gives you a piece of advice, and I don't know if I've...
Let me address something else that you brought up.
One second. It actually says this. You're saying there's 15 definitions or whatever, right?
He says there's no way to prove...
Okay, one second.
A word of universal use carrying such different meanings cannot be used in a rational way and argument without causing immense confusion. That is why all who hope to use reason fruitfully must make it their first duty to agree upon a clear definition of fact. My original video, which you responded to, I defined fact in the exact same way that I defined fact today. And there are multiple ways you can actually define it. Until today, philosophers of science, philosophers of language, they disagree on a definition. So you're saying there's 15 definitions and generally they all say these things. It's not that simple.
No, it is that simple. I showed a half a dozen definitions that all agree on the primary point, that it is information that can be verified. When you define fact, in your video, you gave two different definitions. One of them contradicted the other one. You said that a fact is something that is absolute, like the Earth going around the sun, which, by the way, is a theory, and you said a theory can't be a fact. And then you said that that you define fact as a working model, or the best hypothesis we have currently for the data, which also doesn't make any sense and doesn't define fact. And you can't find any definitive source to support you on either one.
Okay. So
Actually, I'm going to stop you there.
Can I just say one thing?
I have a feeling
10
it won't
seconds.
be just one thing. We'll see. I'll get you one more if he
10
gets one more.
Okay. We can observe the Earth going around the sun. I don't know why you're calling it a theory. Okay?
Because you don't know what theory means. I just read the definition. It's a body of knowledge in a field of study. It encompasses facts and laws and testable hypotheses. And
It's a direct observation.
Yes, like evolution is. Even macroevolution
Okay,
is.
you're again conflating evolution with Darwinian evolution. If I ask you, do you believe
No.
do you believe in Lamarckian
I corrected
evolution?
your misinterpretation.
Okay, do you believe in Lamarckian evolution?
No.
All right,
so
I'm
there's
going to
a
stop you
difference.
guys there because now we're going somewhere else. And you'll get a lot more chances to talk in a few minutes. We're going to take 5-ish, let's see, what time is it? On my smartphone, it's 8:07. So let's meet back here at 8:15, and we're going to give you guys a voice by reading some of your questions and letting them respond. Thank you.
I need a signed copy of it.
Hi.
I'm a PhD student in evolutionary biology. I just defended my thesis in November. And what's really interesting is he keeps talking about Ney, and Ney was the thesis advisor for a professor in my department. And the thing that he says about Darwinian evolution is that he thinks that natural selection exists to eliminate deleterious genotypes. And that's what he's actually saying. He just
Are you saying that my
misquoting.
opponent is quoting from scientists when he doesn't understand what they're saying?
I'm afraid so.
Could you tell him that, please?
If I thought he would listen to what I had to say.
I would appreciate it if you would.
Okay.
Yes. For believers, it's very much a matter of authority. So, and if he's going to be citing people, he needs to know what they're saying.
All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and get us started again, even though I still haven't read through all of these, because I'm sure while these guys debate, I can read, right? I'm sure I'll be able to concentrate on what's in front of me. So let's go ahead and wind down conversation, and we'll get started again. This is where the teacher in the room would say, clap once if you can hear the sound of my voice. Good. Oh, that's so good. We've got a lot of questions here most of these are directed at one of the two of you, so I'm going to try to go back and forth, and I will honor your time and be done by 9. Several of the questions are similar, so I may lump some together, but we will start with this one is for Subboor. The question is, and if I say this incorrectly, it's on you for not being written clearly. So it's the best I can do. Even if we grant your assertion that Darwinian evolution is not valid and all life is the result of a creator, what is the basis for assuming that Allah is this creator instead of some other God? It seems like even if you could prove evolution was false, it still does not follow that Islam is true, does it? Do you need me to read it again or you got it?
No, I'll try and remember it.
Okay, I'll put it here in case
Okay,
you want to.
that's fine. So I just want to clarify my position. I'm not here to show evolution is wrong. Evolution is an observation. We can actually see it. Just to give you a small, beautiful example of what might be considered a macro evolution or a micro evolution. I don't like using the terms micro and macro. There's a whole discussion about whether we should use them or not. So it's better just to use evolution simply means biological change, tree of life, and natural selection. So I have no problem with evolution. I have absolutely no problem with Darwinian evolution either. It's a working model, it's a working paradigm, it's a working theory. Nobody should ever get in the way of scientists doing their work. Now, in regards to an alternative, I'm not here to preach and explain that since Darwinian evolution is wrong, therefore, you guys should basically become Muslim. I'm not here to do that. What I am here to do is to say that Darwinian evolution, just like any other theory in science, is not absolute. And Darwinian evolution, I believe, has been hijacked by some people who want to turn it into a religion, which is the same book I was referring to, Darwinism as Religion, written by Michael Roos, who is an atheist, and he is also a Darwinist, so it's not a derogatory term, I don't mean to insult anyone. And I don't believe it should be turned into a religion. Like, for example, I'm sure Aaron's aware of Julian Huxley, his book, Religion Without Revelation, which was Darwinism, right? Okay, that's a really good picture. I'm not here to do any of those things. I'm simply here to show it is just like any other theory in science. It is not absolute. That's all.
If I may address that, he keeps trying to distinguish evolution and Darwinian evolution as if they're different, but he's accepting the natural selection, which is the Darwinian part, and that's the microevolution part. He hasn't recognized still that he's talking about micro and macro. I don't know why he hasn't pieced that together, but we are not talking, there's not a distinction between evolution on one side and Darwinism on the other. Darwinian evolution is the natural selection thing, that's the micro part. You've got it backwards. Just call it evolution. That's what it is.
Okay, just wanted to clarify that. Like I mentioned in my talk previously, zoonomia and philosophy, or zoological philosophy, decades before Darwin, Erasmus Darwin and John Baptiste Lamarck, they used evolution in the sense of biological change over time. Darwin came later. So when I'm referring to evolution, I'm not referring to natural selection working at the micro scale. I'm not just referring to the Catchwell's moth experiment, anything like that. I'm simply referring to the way it was used previously, and still today is still a valid way of defining it. For example, the Daphnia flea, when it recognizes there's a predator in the water, it grows a helmet and a tail spike. That's evolution. There's nothing wrong with generally believing in biological change over time. Now, as a theory, I don't use the terms micro and macro, and I believe it's not my territory to decide whether they are valid terms or not. For example...
But that's what you're describing.
For example, there's a whole discussion amongst evolutionary biologists about whether those terms should be used or not, right? I just keep away because it's a bit of a contentious issue, right? I do believe in evolution as an observation, as it was defined before Darwin. Until today, it is valid. What I do not believe is an observation, is the tree of life, or the web of life, or the hedge of life, or the bush of life, and nor do I believe natural selection working on mutations being the cause behind all of this is epistemically the same way as an observation of the Daphnia flea. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Go ahead and respond to that, but then we're going to get to more questions. Yeah.
Sure.
For the last 20 years, I've been making a challenge that I can prove evolution to your satisfaction. And I've made this challenge to dozens of people, and to date, only one person has actually taken the challenge and gone to fruition in the conversation. I say, okay, there's going to be a series of questions. You have to answer the questions. If you repeatedly ignore any direct questions, it's default, and I am under no obligation to proceed any further. There's only been one time that anybody took that challenge and actually went through all the questions. That person not only accepted evolution, but she later married me. I would like to
so
wonder.
So ladies, if you were wondering.
So I would like to wonder, what would it take to change your mind? Because it is a fact, and I can prove it.
Okay. But y'all are going to have to take that argument until afterwards. But now I want to get to everybody's questions. If we run out, I'll let you spar some more. This one's juicy, and I think this is mostly directed at you, but I'll let you each take a stab at it. How does evolution reconcile such a useless genetic mutation such as homosexuality, since that contradicts the, quote, survival of the fittest principle?
Homosexuality might be a reaction to overpopulation. There's one of the mathematical equations on how homosexuality occurs in any breeding population, the percentage. And mathematically it works out that if an organism, or if a collective becomes to volume is for one group, that percentage that are homosexual will help restrict that growth.
That's a good answer. All right. Do you want to speak to that at all?
There's a philosopher of science called David Stove. He's written a book about, even though he's an atheist and he doesn't believe in creationism or anything like that, he just speaks about assumptions or predictions, if the Darwinian paradigm was true, whether those are actually confirmed. And his book is called Darwinian Fairy Tales, and what he goes through is homosexuality and other things which for him don't make sense under his particular worldview. Now, I'm not here to make any comments on homosexuality at all, but what I will say is I agree with David Stove's conclusion, which is the conclusion which I think any rational person can accept, which is Darwin's theory of evolution, even though it's the best thing we currently have as a paradigm, is not true in an absolute sense. And that's all I'm actually here to do. And my position is echoed by other, secular academics. It's not some new...
Well, you see, you keep saying that, but the citations you bring up don't agree with you.
Okay, so...
They don't make the point that you
And to
think
our
they
next
make.
question. All right. This is fun, you guys. This question goes to Subboor.
Yep.
It says, how can you claim that... I'm sorry, this sentence is funny to me. How can you claim that humans and mushrooms are so different as to refute evolution? Their genetic code is the same. Many of their enzymes and structural proteins are functional substitutes. Their organelles are the same. Their means of replicating are mechanically related. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, it does. It sounds tasty.
Oh my. Woo. Here it is. If you want.
So, yeah. Just to go back, nothing I said today about the people are referring to as my interpretation of what they think. The question is referring to something which I mentioned from evolution and evidence, the logic behind the science. And what it basically says there is to use homology and to say, look, because these two things are similar, therefore they must have a common ancestor, and these two things are different, so therefore they don't have a common ancestor. The quote was basically in the context of you can't say a must within a probabilistic framework, because a probabilistic framework is based upon assumptions, Bayesian's decomposition with 9 mathematical assumptions, plus they are conceptual problems such as defining homology in a non-circular way, and also the existence of homoplasy. So mushrooms are tasty, but I don't really disagree with them being tasty.
You didn't comment on the sex life of mushrooms, but we'll save that for another night. This question is for Aron. It says, what degree of influence... By the way, whoever wrote this question, excellent penmanship. What degree of influence do the alternatives to Darwinian evolution, i.e. the third way, hold in the scientific community? Are they being seriously considered by mainstream scientists, or are they, quote, fringe? You want to read it again?
The problem with some of the claims that the scientists are making is, although there are other mechanisms, they don't have the same weight as natural selection does. I mean, there's like a niche generation, for example.
Niche construction.
Niche construction, thank you. These, while they are factors in the development of life or the evolution of life, they're not necessarily the type of mechanism that they're playing them out to be. They certainly aren't a challenge. So there's nothing that anybody is bringing up as far as the new mechanisms that they want to purport that actually displaces of natural selection. There's certainly nothing that disproves natural selection. Everything that they suggest is actually concordant with what we already know. This is just additional information at best. Nobody's come up with a third way that disproves or discards the prior ways. And I don't know what they mean by the third way. And the reason I have to question what he's saying when he brings up these things, and I don't know, is because he mentioned something in his video about the people comparing the genome and human DNA and all that. I had to get a geneticist friend of mine to find out what paper he was citing, right, and then look it up. So I've got a professional geneticist who's reading this who says, I don't know what this guy's talking about. What, 1.3 billion letters, they ignored it? Where does it say that? So we're both reading through it, and neither one of us could glean from it what you did. So this is why I'm convinced that you simply don't understand the arguments that you're reading.
Okay. Two quick things there. One, I'm going to refer to the alternatives and also that. So, number one, in regards to that paper itself, it's on the video, which is there's two particular papers I cited. One was that paper from Nature, which title I don't remember, but it's in the YouTube video, it's embedded in there. The second was the relative differences, the myth of 1%, and John Cohen and other evolutionary biologists, they're speaking about the 1% is a gross oversimplification, and they currently don't know enough to work out percentage. Now that's their view, okay, as I was referring to those two things. Now in regards to niche construction, it's not an alternative, right? I believe it can, there's a book that was just recently published by Princeton, and what they said is these are the people who are putting forth niche construction as a theory. And they have found a way of incorporating it within Darwinism, the neo-Darwinism mechanism. So that's not a problem. But the other, the third way of evolution, guys, like, okay, the question is, are they fringe? Okay, two things here. Number one, if they are fringe, Darwin at one point was fringe, but he became mainstream. Two, one of the people that's on here is Carl Woese, whose published papers you can find on the thirdwayofelution.com. And he discovered the third domain of life, archaea. So even if they were fringe, and they're not, frankly, it would be irrelevant, because let's just assume there was no alternative. Let's just go with that. Let's just assume there was no alternative. And you know, these guys from Oxford, MIT, Princeton, Harvard, and Oxford, and whatever, right? They weren't there. Even in that case, according to philosophers of science, there are alternatives to our best theories, equally well confirmed by the evidence, even if we are unable to conceive of them at the time. This is what Kyle Stanford, a philosopher of science, says. And he's an atheist, and he doesn't have any sort of religious bias. So this is mainstream understanding of philosophy of science. Yes, the views of evolutionary biology that I was referring to are, number one, I don't endorse them. Two, I do agree they're not like, there may be mainstream biologists pushing it, as in terms of secular biologists, but they haven't taken a foothold in the scientific community. The reason why I raised them is not that I endorse them, is to show there is a discussion going on. Because that discussion exists because they obviously understand it's not absolute.
Then help me, but no, that's not what they're saying. That's not even their understanding. So on the concept of niche construction, how would that impugn, or how would that challenge natural selection?
It doesn't.
Thank you.
No. That's the point.
This is so easy, you guys.
Well, that's the whole problem with presenting this third way, is that every one of these mechanisms
okay, Aaron,
isn't really a challenge for what we already know.
Just a second there. I mentioned that at the beginning. That's what the book says. When you mentioned niche construction is not an alternative because they found a way of incorporating it within the current current paradigm. The other mechanisms, they haven't. And the people proposing the mechanisms, such as James Shapiro, they do not believe that Darwinism has any hope in terms of its mechanism.
You're going to have to be really specific about that, because I've heard these arguments and I've read these arguments that these people are making, and a lot of them just don't have the substance for the very reason you just illustrated yourself.
Okay.
That niche construction has nothing to say against natural selection.
Yeah, but niche construction is not an alternative. I never mentioned it as an alternative. I mentioned...
know that. I know what you're not saying.
Yep.
Okay. But in the case of any of these other mechanisms that they want to bring up, there's nothing that actually challenges or replaces what we already know. It just adds to it. That's it. So why would you come up with a third way that's distinct? You wouldn't.
Okay, no, okay.
Because you already accepted natural selection as a fact, right?
And I'm going to stop you guys because he
did
did just answer the question that came in, that specific question.
Okay.
Just to be fair there. But again, sparring later. That's the after party. This question is for Subboor. It says, do you believe in multiple episodes of creation? If not, how do you account for only primitive organisms in the earliest fossils?
Repeat the question again, please.
Do you believe in multiple episodes of creation? If not, how do you account for only primitive organisms in the earliest fossils?
Okay.
Take a look at that.
I'm guessing it's referring to multiple origins here. There are loads of possible creation scenarios, right? And I'm not endorsing one particular one, okay? Because as a Muslim, when it comes to the creation story, we don't have a I mean, we don't have this belief, which is in the Bible, that they are separate kinds, and these kinds are unchangeable. It's actually like there's silence. And even when I try to look up what was the date, when do we as Muslims believe there was the first Adam, basically the first human? What I got was there is no date. And okay, what about Homo erectus, Homo naledi, and these things? And the answer I got was, okay, other things existed, and then Adam was created separately. Now, just on this issue of creation, there's a book called the Padma Purana, which is a 3,000-year-old Hindu text, right? And in this book, it gives a very clear picture of the creation of life being like a tree of life, identical in not its details, but its structure of Darwin's tree of life. And now basically, Professor of Sanskrit at Oxford University, Monier Williams, he basically explains, look, the Hindus were Darwinists centuries before Darwin in regards to their sort of thing. So whoever comes up with a creation story of some kind, and I'm using creation very vaguely here, right? Because even if you don't believe in God, you still believe that things exist, there's some form of creation, right? It doesn't matter where it came from, because just to disprove from where it came from would be the genetic fallacy. We have a very clear description of the tree of life in the Padma Purana, which is 3,000 years old, but it would be ridiculous for me to sit here and say, because it's in that ancient book, and then Darwin later adopted it, and his grandfather Erasmus Darwin wrote about this sort of gradual beginning in zoonomia. You can't shoot an idea down because of where it comes from. If you see my point, you have to look at the validity of the idea itself. And the reason why we're speaking about the mechanism is if the mechanism fails, then the history of life too fails, because the tree of life idea existed prior to Darwin. And it came down to the Greek philosophers, and then it came down to the Enlightenment, and it was well known as an idea before Darwin. Darwin came along and he filled the gap, which was a mechanism by which it happened, natural selection working on variations. Hence why there's so much controversy when you bring up problems with the mechanism. But I just want to reiterate this one last point again and again. I don't endorse any of those alternatives. I was just showing them as the fact that there exists a disagreement about some of the core ideas of Darwinism.
Okay, I just wanted to mention
Sure.
that the Purana, I'm pretty sure that's the right one. I don't have batteries on here to check it, but I'm pretty sure the Purana was contextually dated to about 2,600 years or so. It can't be 3,000 years because it mentions Buddha. And it says that Buddha was an incarnation of Vishnu, and that he appeared in this guise to delude the atheists. But simultaneously, also contextually dated to around 2,600 years ago, is the Bhagavad Gita, in which Krishna complains about demonic people who believe that the biodiversity comes only from cohabitation and lust, no more than this. The different species breed themselves. We're supposed to read it. I don't remember the exact quote, but that's basically what it says.
I wish I could think of a clever segue from that. This question, it doesn't say who it's for, but I'm gathering it's for you. But this is what it says. Changes in organisms are apparent. Even interspecies mutations can be observed over time. But we have never seen a transition from one species to another, and then in parentheses, fish to cow, let's say. Doesn't it take faith to accept that Darwinian evolution, something we've never observed, is true?
My book lists dozens of observed speciation events. We have seen the emergence of new species. Cow is not a species, just to give you an idea.
I just read the cards.
Okay. What was the example given here of fish to cow? We actually have, for paleontology, we can actually show this one because we do have quite a fluid transition into tetrapods, and we go a long way before we get into cattle and then cows and things like that. But yes, we have observed the origin of new species or divergence of new species.
Basically, doesn't it take faith to be a Darwinist?
Yeah,
the
no.
evolutionist.
Any belief that I'm an anti-theist. I'm also an epistivist. An epistivist is somebody who rejects faith as being the most dishonest position it is possible to have. Any belief that requires faith should be rejected for that reason.
Okay. I just want to make a quick point about changes in the species. Let's just assume it's a species for the sake of answering this question, the cow and the fish. I would say, I mean, I'm guessing you're a Christian, whoever asked this question. I would say, look, scientists, they have this working paradigm, right? The Darwinian evolution, right? Leave it alone as a paradigm. Leave it alone as a theory. Let them do their work. There's no reason to bring your theology, or even me as a Muslim, my theology, and try and challenge scientists. But just on this particular question, there's 26 different definitions of species, right? And it's not as simple as, oh, you know, yeah, we work with this species, we worked out this is related to that. Even though there's a mechanism and there's an explanatory power behind the mechanism, theoretically, something could be, but it doesn't mean it was. There's a difference. Theoretically, it could be. So, for example, how did this thing evolve? Oh, it could have been this. It doesn't mean that's actually the way it happened. So I think it's very important to sort of make a distinction in those things. And lastly, I'd like to ask this question. Say the fish did lead to the cow. How on earth would that change your belief or your faith? I mean, okay, there's a link between the fish and the cow. You shouldn't, I mean, I'm a strong believer, like Professor Alistair McGrath at Oxford University, who's a Christian theologian, former atheist. And he basically says, look, let the scientists do their work. Okay, I don't believe in it, and things can change, but let them do their work. Don't get involved in these, crazy creation science type things, which actually hinder the progress of science. Let it be as a paradigm, let it be as a model, let it be as a theory, let them do their work, because at the end of the day, what they're doing is saving lives. Something that, for example, in the Quran it says, whoever saves the life of one human being saves the lives of all, which is also in the Torah, the Old Testament. So let the scientists do their work. Don't bring theology into it. I'm a strong believer in that.
So since we have the creationist defending evolution, let the atheist also defend Christianity for a moment, just to be amusing.
I'll allow it.
It is possible to interpret the Bible when it says that God said, let the earth bring forth. Read it literally.
All right. I was trying to think if we could squeeze two questions in, but I think you guys have proven we cannot. I'm going to do one more question because I've been told that we actually need to end by 8:45, so you guys can actually be gone by 9. So this question just says, what is the most important point you want to make? So this is a freebie. You can each end on one point that you most want to have the audience hear before we leave. And I didn't make this up. This is a real card. What is the one point, the most important point you want to make?
Well, if you're going to me first, it is, the fact being data that can be confirmed, that there's something that we can show to be true, that it's not assumptions. It certainly damn sure isn't speculation. We have ways we can show this, and we can prove it, and we can verify it. And I'd be happy to do that for you, but of course it's going to take some time to work it out. And I would rather do that in a written format, because then we can compare data and, show links and so forth. But it would be just that this is not faith. This is not a religious position. This is something we know and can show.
And you rhymed, so that's pretty awesome.
The most important thing I'd like to say is that whenever there is a paradigm that exists in science, it doesn't mean that that paradigm is absolute, is true in an absolute sense. The philosopher of science and astrophysicist Thomas Kuhn, he wrote a book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and he speaks about how there was major paradigm shifts, and the history of science shows these major paradigm shifts. For example, from the classical Newtonian worldview to the quantum and the relativistic worldview, in which what happened, and I want you guys to realize this, what happened, 200 years, we had Newtonian predictions precisely. This planet is going to be in this place at this particular motion on this day. And it was there. But the fundamental assumptions of that world, of that paradigm, turned out to be false. According to today's paradigm, the relativistic paradigm, which is time and space are fixed. Now they assume to be dynamic. there is the definition of mass itself changed. Gravity is no longer a pulling force, it's actually space-time curvature, and it's a pushing force. Look at those conceptual changes, and according to some evolutionary biologists like James Shapiro, biology is going through a similar conceptual revolution. So just because, and even if it wasn't, assume Darwinian evolution as a paradigm is going to exist for the next 1,000 years. There's no reason for any person, Muslim, Christian, atheist, to attack it as a scientific theory. Let the scientists do their work. Just don't turn it into a religion, which is something I believe has happened to Darwinism. It has been hijacked, the theory itself has been hijacked by some people like Richard Dawkins, who says Darwin allowed him to be an intellectually satisfied atheist. He says this in The Blind Watchmaker. I don't think he should use his position in science to propagate his belief.
All right.
Which, by the way, that bore no resemblance to a religion.
What is?
What you just described of Dawkins. That bore no being intellectually satisfied just means that you know that you're justified. Whatever you believe for reasons. Sure. Right? Not faith, reasons. That means not religion.
Okay. Darwinism as religion, the book I was referring to, it speaks about, yes, it gives them that intellectual satisfaction, Darwinism. But should it lead them to be convinced of atheism? And as you in your book, The First Foundational Falsehood, which I agree with you, and also I read the part about pronouncing your name, I couldn't get that right. But anyway, the first foundational falsehood, I agree with you. Why equate evolution with atheism? So that's something we can agree about. It shouldn't be turned into a baton to bash the religious people with. Evolution equals evolution. It doesn't equal atheism.
All right, I'm going to wrap it up on that note, and thank you guys both for coming and for being gracious sports, and I didn't have to break any fist fights, which is wonderful. Thank you all for coming. Did you have any closing remarks, Vic? Okay.
Thanks to everybody for coming. Thank you very much to both of our debate participants, and as well as